Good morning, good afternoon. Greetings from sunny South Beach, Florida. I'm sorry that I can't be with you live, sending this recorded message due to some technical problems to share my passion for quantum computing and how quantum computing is moving from science and academia into the real enterprise world. Probably most of you at this point have read or heard about quantum computing, and I'll share some images here. They are beautiful machines. This is a close-up of an IBM quantum computer. You see a lot of gold, but also copper. The actual computational unit, called a qubit, is at the very bottom of this shaft that you see in the middle, and all these wires are control and measurement lines that will help operate this qubit. But they look like big, crazy chandeliers in a French castle, which is quite beautiful. To give you a little bit of understanding of what a quantum computer does, you see this little animation here, and think of this as kind of a ball, a round spherical space, which is not a physical space, but a mathematical space called a Hilbert space. And in this space, you have an element evolving in the middle. And this element has a spin and a vector, a force, which will hit different points on the inside of this sphere. And that is how you do the measurement of a qubit. A qubit being this quantum equivalent of a quantum bit in a classical computer, the laptops, machines, but also supercomputers sitting in high performance computing centers that are limited to this binary kind of approach and output where everything is coded in a negative or positive electrical pulse that is then translated into a 0 or a 1. Quantum computers, through this state of superposition, is what we call this, can give you an infinite number in a distribution of values on this inner space of the Hilbert sphere. So instead of getting zeros and ones, you're getting a distribution of every and any value between 0 and 1, and you get it all at the same time. Many of you are probably familiar with Schrödinger's cat, the famous thought experiment by Professor Schrödinger, where a cat in a box is both alive and dead at the same point, and it's only when you open it due to a little poison pill that you will know she's actually dead or alive. And this is the same principle here. When you start to measure this qubit, it takes one specific value, but when you don't measure it, it has this state of superposition with every value at the same time. And this is what allows us to solve certain mathematical problems that classical computers are just not good at solving at. On top of that, we get what is called a quantum speedup. If you take one qubit, let's say here on the right side, you can actually entangle it with a second qubit, meaning you give your initial qubit a set of values, the spin you wanted to have, the vector you wanted to have. You, what we say, initiate it to represent the mathematical equation that you want to perform. You can entangle this with a second qubit, meaning the second qubit will take the same state, the same properties, and as the initial qubit evolves and changes throughout that computation, the second qubit will do exactly the same. So in a classical computer where you go from 1 bit to 2 bits to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6, you have linear scaling in computational power. In quantum computing, you have exponential scaling because you go from one qubit that is entangled with a second qubit, or potentially more, to a second qubit that is also entangled with a second qubit. So you go directly from 1 to 4, and this is how you exponentially scale. So not only do you have the state of superposition, which gives you a completely different approach to solving mathematical problems, you also have this computational speed up through an exponential delivery of the results. And that is what makes quantum computing so interesting? Richard Feynman, a very influential and famous professor from the 70s, 80s, who really advanced this field, famously said, nature isn't classical, damn it. And if you want to make a simulation of nature, you'd better make it quantum mechanical. What he means is that, you know, a lot of the big problems in our world aren't good at being solved in a classical way. Sure, you know, I'm drinking my grapefruit soda here. If I ask a classical computer, is there grapefruit soda in my can, yes or no, I can get a great response, and I can get it very fast and very reliable. 0 or 1, yes or no, there is soda in it. However, we have hurricane season approaching here in Miami. Hopefully we'll all be safe. But predicting something like a hurricane, that depends on thousands of variables. Interacting with thousands of other variables. This dynamic system, we call an optimization problem. A classical computer is really, really bad at calculating. And that's where quantum computing, in theory, can deploy all of its performance. But mathematically, we call this the NP versus P complete hard problem. As you go up here, the mathematical complexity increases. And these are just some very smart people that sat down and looked at all the different problems in our world and a mathematical description. And what they found is that there are certain problems. I mentioned the weather, but finding a cure for a disease like COVID, optimizing your financial portfolio, that are inherently just really, really difficult for this classical system of binary 0 and 1 codes to comprehend, and really lend themselves for a quantum computer with this state of superposition to be solved much easier. And it's been now 20 years that many big companies, this is IBM, but also Amazon, Google, Intel, Baidu, Tencent, Fujitsu, and many others have tried to harness these properties of superposition and entanglement and build actual quantum computers with it. And these used to be huge machines. Again, the first one by IBM almost 20 years ago. Only a couple qubits that were completely useless, couldn't do anything, but a proof of concept, I guess, just like a startup. And these were big, bulky machines that really didn't have any use. Today, and we're sticking with IBM in our storyline here, they look much more enterprise ready already. Actually, you have one of these golden chandeliers, and each of these two white boxes that you see hanging off that metal scaffolding. And that box is a cryogenic fridge, which cools the entire quantum computer down to almost absolute 0, the coldest temperature that we've ever known, colder than space and anything else known to human kind, to avoid external interference, because these little qubits and their state of superposition and entanglement, very, very sensitive to external noise, temperature changes, frequency waves, and any kind of external interference. So you need to shield them as much as possible. This system now has 137 qubits, so a big improvement to the initial system. But the quality, despite this cryogenic fridge and all the efforts to shield it, the quality of these qubits is still very, very low. They have very low coherence times, meaning they keep their state of quantumness for only a fraction of a second. They are very slow, which makes it difficult to put a computation through them. And they produce a lot of errors. But big progress compared to what we saw just a few years ago. IBM, again here, and I'll play a little video, just made an announcement a few days ago where they think that by 2025, maybe a year sooner, maybe a year later, they will actually be able to take these fridges, and you see how they have a much nicer housing and casing already, and connect them amongst each other by the hundreds, if not thousands. So now you take a quantum computer that has 137 qubits, or maybe it will have 2, 3, 400 by the time this happens, and you connect it with hundreds or thousands of others. And this is how you then get to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or potentially millions of qubits, which is what we believe is needed to actually solve some of these NP-hard problems. So a very, very clear roadmap now that has emerged from the initial discovery of quantum mechanics and physics by Einstein, Bohr, Heisenberg, Max Planck, and many others in the 30s, to the first experimental machines 15 or 20 years ago, to know things that are, starting to really deliver value. Beyond these big vendors, there's also a large, or relatively large, ecosystem of startups. You see that the trend here is growing, but nothing super crazy. We count about 500 startups globally that work in quantum technologies, and that is not just quantum computing. You can use these same properties of superposition and entanglement to build sensors, to build quantum communication networks, also to do quantum key distribution, which has an impact on the security and current encryption standards. In quantum computing, there is probably 60 or 70 startups that are building quantum computing hardware globally. These companies, and this slide is a little over a year old, everything that you see in light green is now light or dark blue here, and some regions added. But no surprise, the US is the big leader just in terms of activity, with 150 startups and vendors that we're counting there. Canada really doing a fantastic job. They got a very early start at the University of Waterloo, and a quantum computing center built there, and a nationwide ecosystem today. Russia, at this point, is almost irrelevant in quantum. China, and this data, don't trust it, because there's a lot of secrets, of course, in this industry. But China is probably the largest, both financially as well in terms of volume, when it comes to quantum computing. And Europe is a really, really strong contender for a leadership position. The UK itself has an enormously well-funded and strong program. Here in blue, you see the Netherlands, but also the European Union flagship program for quantum computing, and the large European countries that all have very strong efforts. The same in Israel. Over here, you have Japan with a very strong program, Australia, but you see how this is still confined to mostly the large states that also have the research capability and universities to take this science to commercialization. In terms of government grants, it's very, very impressive. I start with China, where here we have 11.3 billion in government funds having been spent. We actually believe this number might be double in reality, well over 20 billion, which is a huge commitment to quantum technologies. The UK, 2.5 billion, Germany probably close to 7 billion, the European Union with its own program, France with a very well-funded program. In the US, we actually had an announcement just a few days ago for 2 new White House directives that will multiply the US investment, and Canada, a very strong investment at all. So you see that these government dollars that are flowing into quantum are actually extremely significant, and make it probably more important than many other technologies that you might be more familiar with. When it comes to the market itself, we did a little forecast here 2 years ago, and forecasted the revenues being made in quantum computing to be just about 300 million in 2021. A competitor and friend of ours actually ended up doing a survey for the year 2021, and found that it was about 250 million, so we weren't too far off. 75% of that, however, is research activity. So at JP Morgan, working with IBM or one of these startups on a mathematical problem, use case discovery, rather than actually implementing a real application for a quantum computer, because we're just not ready for that yet. If you look at private investment dollars, the picture is a little different. We count probably $15 billion at this point that have been invested by venture capitalists, very little private equity, but definitely some angel investing into quantum technologies globally, which is tiny. We're probably at a 3 billion run rate yearly now, up from $1 billion the previous year and much less than $1 billion 2 years ago. This compares to 620 billion invested by VCs in all technologies together, about 90 billion in artificial intelligence, or 17 billion last year alone in blockchain, just for comparison. So you see, this is a fast-growing market, but still very, very small when it comes to the commercial use of it. Here we have a little bit of a chart with use cases. So we talked about these NP-hard problems, and I gave a few examples. Don't worry too much about the detail on the outer burst, but the industries that are really heavy in these optimization, factorization problems, and so forth, everything that falls into this NP-hard category is finance, for example, especially Wall Street. I had an office on Wall Street in New York for many years, and a lot of the core processes that a bank like that has to rely on fall into this category, from risk assessment to predictive modeling, Monte Carlo for option and derivative pricing, portfolio optimization, fraud prevention, and so forth. So most of the large banks now have small internal teams to actually work on these efforts together with partners. High tech is a big field of application. Pharmaceuticals, everything that is drug design, drug discovery, personalized treatments, protein folding, falls square into this field of NP-hard problems, and is what we believe to be the most near-term application for a quantum computer, probably somewhere in the next 2 to 4 years, assuming that these vendors like IBM actually deliver on the roadmaps that they promised. Other fields, chemistry, material science, energy, logistics, very relevant. I'll point out here in red, QML, quantum machine learning. And Google, that is one of the leaders in quantum computing, actually with 2 corporate efforts, just a couple months ago spun out one of them into a new company called Sandbox AQ. AQ standing for artificial intelligence, quantum, Q for quantum, of course. So this Google's and now Sandbox's the statement and commitment to building quantum only for machine learning. And machine learning, when you look at these neural networks, is a typical optimization problem. So this is something which is a little more medium to long term, 5 to 10 years probably, but will have a huge impact as quantum computing matures. Lastly, and this is data from the US only, unfortunately, but one of the big challenges to make all of this happen is the workforce. As we take it out of the universities and research labs into the commercial world, we need experts that are able to do that, not just at the engineering, science, and research level, but also sales, marketing, business development, legal, HR, and so forth. We estimate the universe in the US to be just about 2,500 people with the skills and experience to do that. And a lot of these people are in research, as you see here. A lot of these people are already dedicated and working to building quantum computing hardware, algorithms, and software, with very few people available to take on new roles. They are also geographically, very, very highly concentrated around some key universities. Most of them have PhDs, which is fantastic, and we need more PhDs. But we also need these other educational backgrounds to help with some of these other roles as quantum becomes more and more commercial. You see, it really comes out of only a dozen universities in the US, and most other regions, you're going to depend of a half a dozen or really a small handful of universities with the ability to do this. And most people, workforce by tenure, actually have very, very little experience in this field, which is great because they will learn and be very impactful in the years to come. However, it also means that we're lacking experience. So having the workforce, also the diversity, very, very few women in leadership roles, very, very little ethnic diversity in the field. It is dominated by white men. This is going to be one of the biggest challenges as we take quantum out of the universities and research labs into the commercial world. I hope I could give you a little bit of an overview and introduction and appetite for the spooky world of quantum computing. Sorry again that I couldn't be there live in person. Feel free to look me up on LinkedIn, Twitter, or my website, andrekönig.com, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.